Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Just briefly before we get into this episode and chat about lizards, I want to, apologize for missing a couple episodes this month. I've been away. I've been exploring some opportunities. Been on a bit of a trip. I was trying my darndest to be prepared and have a bunch of interviews in the bank. I thought maybe I would do some on the road, and things were just too wild and crazy. I'm still learning how to integrate mind under matter and into everything else that I do with creating space for other things. And we kept up with mind under matter, had enough in the bank to cover the entire period that I was away. And that show has a weekly episode, a weekly bonus episode, a monthly bonus episode. And so it was kind of all that we could do to get ahead on that. Fell behind on here. We are getting caught back up now. Already recorded the episode for next week, which is a good one as well. And lining up some guests. I'm excited to have a good fall ahead. Actually trying to scramble to get caught up and ahead again before I leave again. Going to Vegas for emceeing this 𝕊𝕐𝕒𝕄𝕚 conference, going to LA to do some podcasts. I did Pete Holmes' You Made It Weird podcast, one of my favorite humans on earth, made my 5th appearance, and it's one of my favorite podcasts, and I've been on more than any other guest. So it's really cool and flattering that I get to be a regular on basically my favorite podcast. So check that out if you like. And I've just been busy generally. I just got super overwhelmed this summer. Fortunately, I was like being active and getting some exercise, because I was also kind of miserable in certain ways at the same time. It's because as things started opening up, I was just trying to figure out which of the things that I'm working on. I've talked about this on the show before. A lot of times I get hit with long kind of funks and depression when I have when I'm starting off on kind of a new path and sorting out which I have a lot of irons in the fire, and I'm trying to a lot of them are really exciting. They're usually really ambitious, usually take a lot to get them done. Evaluating, what the likelihood of them happening is it realistic? Is it really what I want? Is it figuring out this. Thank you for the Patreon support, by the way. COVID has been an incredible financial burden on me, and still sorting out what I'm going to do in terms of touring, because the plan has still been to start next spring, because I believe this winter is still going to be bad with COVID, and I'm just not. I could go and do like regular comedy in clubs and get a flat fee or something like that. But the way that I structure independent shows to do the things that I like sciencey shows and stuff like that, I produce my own shows. I get, a percentage of the door, and it's already, there's just a lot of factors, and anything that, even safety or social responsibility or whatever aside, anything that, that dramatically reduces consumer confidence in, say, packing indoors shoulder to shoulder is something that is already a challenging thing as an independent producer, as anyone in musicians or anyone else listening would know, is it's already before COVID, I was like, okay, I know I can get X number of butts in a seat to justify this tour and going here to this city, right? And so all of that's more complicated now. And so it's just been, it's been it's been just a heck of a summer, just in terms of figuring out what's next. And I'm kind of, and so part of this trip was clarifying that. And I just feel like it's sometimes rude to my guests to go on a long rant like this before their episode, because this has nothing to do with them. But you guys are regular listeners and want to know about when I'm going to be touring and stuff like that. And I get questions all the time. So I wanted to address it. I just have some cool, I wish I could tell you guys about it. I should be getting some clarity on a few things really soon. Some things are looking pretty promising. One thing in particular is looking pretty promising. And so I hope to tell you about it real soon, because it will mean a change for some things in a lot of ways. But won't be changing this podcast, other than if other things work out for me. It just means that I have more time and energy to away from fretting about figuring out what to do and putting together this and that to earn income, and can just relax and book this show each week and do it in the way that I like, without worrying about how to get highlights to get this number of views and how to get X number of Patreon supporters and that sort of thing. But I do very much appreciate your Patreon support once again, because at the time being, that is everything that is making this show happen. If you happen to be feeling generous, please go to patreon.com Shane Mauss, as that's every single dollar from that goes to supporting the making of this show, paying my editor Matt, my assistant Rihanna, and no one's making a killing on this podcast or on Mind Under Matter. These are things that are growing, and we do because we like it and love doing them. But we don't do ads, and so it's 100% supported by your Patreon support. That's the world that I want to live on, where people pay for the products that they like, rather than being pitched a bunch of stuff that they don't care about during the thing that they like. So if you're into that model, please support patreon.com Shane Mauss. Lots more great episodes coming up. Sorry for the inconsistency of late. Back on track now. Feeling good, feeling optimistic about the rest of the year. That might be foolish, but that's how I feel right now. So, more info soon. Thank you guys for listening.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. I'm Shane Mauss, and I am excited because I get very lucky. One of the reasons why I'm able to get such good guests regularly on this show is I get suggestions from past guests that I like all the time. And I was just having a little poker night with some professor friends recently, and my good friend Jeff Larson put me in touch with the guest today. Sean Doody is joining me today. Sean, can you introduce yourself to everyone and talk about your background and we were just talking about how you're in Florida, one of my favorite parts of it, in Sarasota, and you're teaching at St. Pete's.
Right. USF St. Pete, where I've been for about 4 years as a assistant professor. And before that, I was born in cold Buffalo. When I was 2 years old, I said too cold. So my family moved to Louisiana. Mm-hmm. And I did a couple of degrees there and got the opportunity to go to Australia to do a PhD.
Ooh.
So twist my arm, right, and off I went.
Where in Australia?
Canberra, the capital. Yeah.
Okay.
But my field work
there.
was up in the tropics, studying turtles on a beautiful tropical river. So that was nice. And I stayed there for 14 years and almost didn't come back, but I missed family, so came back and spent a little time in Salt Lake, then back in Louisiana, and then here I am in South Florida, loving it.
Nice. Those are all pretty good places. I think you made the right move leaving Buffalo. It's okay. I've always enjoyed it enough when I went through. Have you ever heard the sentence? It's like a fun linguistic example of odd sentences that are actually grammatically correct but don't sound like it. It's Buffalo, 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 Buffalo. Buffalo, 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 Buffalo. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, you have, because the word buffalo can be a verb to mean to bully.
Yeah.
I'm sure I've mentioned this on the show before. So Buffalo from the city of Buffalo, that bully buffaloes from the city of Buffalo. They themselves also bully buffalo from the city of Buffalo. And I assumed that everyone from Buffalo was familiar with that, like you were. So my very first time performing in Buffalo, I hopped on stage and just started saying buffalo insane number of times if you don't know the context for why I'm saying it. And I did it as if to like ingratiate myself to the people, like, hey, I know your local thing. And it was maybe the most blank stares I've ever received in my entire comedy career. But then we all learned something together. Right. I told them afterwards. But yeah, awesome. So Australia, Florida, cool. Some of my favorite places. And what's your research now?
Mostly an ecologist and conservation biologist. So and I focus on reptiles mainly.
Ooh.
Yeah.
All right. Well, first off, do you know Robert Trivers by chance?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's a friend of mine. I go to before COVID, I'd go down to Jamaica once or twice a year, and I happened to be in the same area that he lives, and we'd always get together. But he would always show me he'd always have pictures of lizards he'd seen around lately, and be like, oh, look at this one here, this female. Oh, that's a hot one.
He's a brilliant thinker, Trivers. He's great.
Yeah, and a very interesting human. All right. Well, let's do some. What are you up for? You want to do like a Lizard 101 episode?
Whatever you want to do, we can do it.
That's what I would like to do, ideally. Just because I think lizards are so fascinating. We can get into things more broadly as well, but I mean, yeah, people like lizards. Sometimes they have them as pets. They're fascinating creatures. So yeah, how do you start a Lizard 101 conversation?
Well, as it relates to the book that we just published.
What's the book?
The Secret Social Lives of Reptiles.
Okay.
And obviously the theme for that book was social behavior and sociality, and it's the lizards that show the best examples of social behavior probably across the board compared to the other reptiles, right? The turtles and the crocodilians and the snakes. So lizards kind of steal the show when it comes to behavior and social behavior. A lot of them tend to be very visual, which we can kind of relate to as humans, where your snakes are less visual and are doing the chemosensory thing and sniffing everything out. Turtles are a little more sort of hidden away. They do use their vision as well. But we can kind of relate to lizards they get a bit of a mixed review. Some people are afraid of them, right? But they're not as bad as the fear of lizards is not as bad as snakes and crocodilians.
Yeah.
Turtles are the favorites, right, for reptiles. Everyone likes turtles.
Right. Yeah. What's that? That's interesting. What is with the lizard? I mean, they do look a little like dragons or something. What's with is there an actual lizard that people need to look out for?
Not so much in this country. Lizards are,
Yeah.
I mean, we've got a few introduced goannas, the big monitor lizards in Florida, and tegus. So those guys, if you grab them, you could pay a price. There's a couple of venomous species out in Southwest and Mexico, the beaded lizard and the Gila monster. But in this country, lizards are not much of a threat to people. Get to Australia and you get these really big 6-foot lizards, and of course the Komodo dragon, right? They're the giant monitor lizard, the Komodo dragon, which occasionally takes a person. So.
How often does a Komodo? It can't be that many. How many people we lose in a year to Komodos?
I don't know what the annual loss to Komodos is. I'd say it's probably one every 10 years or somewhere in that range.
Yeah.
The last story I heard was someone was out relieving themselves and got taken. So I think you have to, you can ward them. You can use a stick to keep them off you. So it's not too hard to avoid them getting you. But every now and then someone makes a mistake.
That's such a weird thing to break it to the family too.
Right.
When what happened? Komodo dragon happened.
Very bad luck. Because even with out west, pumas and cougars, they're we lose less than one per year or something like that, and grizzlies, same thing. It's pretty low numbers annually.
Yeah. Well, so you moved to Sarasota recently. My first ever headlining gig, like 2 or 3 years into comedy, was in Sarasota. It was for New Year's 2006, 2007. And I stayed at a condo there, and it was my first time on the road, and I was so excited. And I got there and there was just lizards everywhere. And I loved it so much. They're all over the place in those parts. Where else are lizards around the United States mostly?
The native lizards are most common, most prevalent in the Southwest. They do really well in deserts. And so if you want to see lizards in the U.S., you go to Arizona and those sort of places. So Arizona, southern Utah, California, New Mexico, etc. But Florida has this amazing diversity of invasive lizards, right, that don't belong here from the pet trade, because Florida and Miami in particular is like the nexus of the pet trade in reptiles. And then people have all these lizards and they get tired of them or whatever and just release them. And now we've got wild populations of, I believe it's somewhere in the order of, I want to say 38 species or something, invasive species of lizards loose in Florida, breeding, spreading, etc. So it's kind of almost taking over the Southwest, where you have your native lizards.
Do they cause many problems? You'd think they would just be a lot of excess food for a lot of things.
Yeah, it's a range, Shane. It's you've got the geckos on your house that are probably not excluding any natives or even competing much with any natives, and then you've got some of the big lizards, the tegus, that are eating the eggs of the American crocodile, which is protected. And some of them are also, the Nile monitor are eating burrowing owls, apparently, to some extent, and those are protected. So there can be some cases where certainly some of these invasives are taking a piece of the pie that affects native wildlife. But there are many species that are not taking a noticeable chunk of the pie that in which we consider there's a huge problem right now.
So regarding so you say the secret social lives of reptiles. Why is it a secret? I mean, I guess it is. You don't commonly think of reptiles as being social. You if you think about ants or other primates or pack hunters or something like that as these classic examples of social life. And
exactly. So that's that one of the two reasons that we felt we needed to publish this book was we think of mammals and birds when we think of the most complex social behavior. And so the student or new researcher interested in social behavior is going to gravitate to mammals or birds and maybe hymenopterans and ants and stuff, as you mentioned. This has created a bias in that we don't know, we've underestimated the social behavior in reptiles. And the other reason, relatedly, is that most people study mammals and birds that are studying vertebrates, not reptiles. So, for example, the number of species of mammals and reptiles is similar, and yet there are 4 times as many studies on mammals than there are reptiles. So you used to the word knowledge gaps, right, Shane? So, we hear about knowledge gaps. With reptile behavior and ecology, it's like, it's not a bunch of knowledge with little gaps in it. It's a giant gap with tiny bits of knowledge in it. So it's reversed. Mm-hmm. We need a word for it, maybe knowledge canyons or something.
Yeah.
So we got that situation. We don't know what's going on. And it's partly because most reptiles are pretty secretive. So yes, there are the lizards down here that you see on your house and what have you, but the majority of reptiles, your snakes, for example, turtles out in ponds and things, we can't watch those animals, see what they're doing all the time. So a lot of reptiles are out at night. Who goes out in the swamps to look at gators at night? So there's a lot of secretive things going on. We don't know what they're doing. And there's been this dichotomy that's come out of this that says mammals and birds are social, reptiles are asocial. And we saw, the 3 of us co-authors who knew the literature pretty well on social behavior in reptiles, knew that this was not a true representation of what's out there. So we are trying to sort of smash that dichotomy and show that there are reptiles that do some pretty amazing social things. And in fact, they go from very solitary to social, depending on which species or group. And that helps us understand how social behavior evolves, right? So we need to understand, if we're going to understand how complex social behavior evolves in things like mammals and birds, we need to trace back to their effectively reptilian ancestors and understand more simple social behavior, right? So we can't really understand the evolution of social behavior without understanding how reptiles play a role.
Yeah, it's such a confusing evolutionary puzzle to understand these things that we value so much. Humans being such social creatures, we value friends and cooperation and altruism. We give to strangers, right, and do all these things, and it's. You hear something like the selfish gene, which is probably a misleading title of a book, but got attention. And but you try to make sense of cooperation through that lens, and it is a little confusing. Why the heck is there social life in a lot of life on this earth is pretty solitary and seems to get along just fine on its own.
Sure. And it's in a lot of cases, in most cases, I think animals are being very solitary in some ways and very social in others. And reptiles are classic, and they'll sit there and do nothing for ages. And if you try to watch them, they'll outweight you, right? And then they'll do something really interesting for 5 minutes, and if you miss it, that's it. And then you've got hours of them doing nothing again. and this contributes to that bias of that they're not doing anything social.
Yeah. You gotta. Has it helped at all to be able to? Do you ever set up cameras? Right? I suppose with the lizards can move so well that seems impossible. Hey, how do you capture this? Because as you were talking about kind of a lot of this behavior being hidden, I was thinking, I paddleboard. I've been paddleboarding a bunch this summer, and I'll see turtles on a log, and I'll try to like be quiet and just float and maybe get my camera out quick. And man, even turtles, notorious for being extremely slow, are a pretty darn skittish species, and they hop off that log the second they get the first glance of anything unusual coming at them. And I don't actually recall seeing lizards in any kind of group, anything that looked like much of a party happening.
Right.
You do see I guess one thing coming to mind is you see like the den of snakes, like keeping one another warm and stuff. You see that on the 𝕊𝕚𝕧𝕤 documentaries. They'll show that sometimes. Then usually it's a solitary lizard just being born, running through that whole pit of snakes or whatever. So how did people determine that lizards were social in the first place, and then how do you go about doing your research? I mean, it does seem like it sounds like you need a lot of patience, but it also sounds like a pretty chill way to spend a day.
Yeah. So for people like me, it's a blast, but it's remember that social can mean interactions between just two individuals. So you're not necessarily looking for a huge group. We do see big groups of lizards communally nesting. Iguanas do it, skinks do it. There's a bunch of different lizards that the moms all get together and nest in the same area. And that's something I've studied for quite a long time. And there's always some moms that are nesting solitarily too, but usually you get most of the moms of a species or a population nesting together, and we're still trying to understand the benefits of that. It looks like the moms are sharing information, right? So if you're a lizard, especially if you're kind of small, like the little skinks, you got to go out and find a site that has the right temperature and moisture to put your eggs, because you don't stay with your eggs usually. And so you got to be careful and pick the right site where the eggs are going to hatch and pass on your genes. Well, if you come across another mother's eggs, she's wired the same as you, looking for the same thing. So you can save time, energy, and perhaps not get eaten by a bird by spending too much time looking, by adding your eggs to her eggs. And so we see a lot of that. So the benefits could be to the mother, could be to the eggs, or even the hatchlings when they hatch. So communal nesting is a big one for lizards. Another neat lizard story is we think of monogamy as being pretty rare, right, in animals, and there's even arguments about it in humans, right? How monogamous are humans? And so we would expect it to be pretty rare in reptiles, and we don't know. But there's a lizard in Australia, the sleepy lizard, which has something called seasonal monogamy, in which pairs get together during the breeding season for several weeks to a couple of months, and they mate regularly. They then spend the rest of the year off on their own separately, and then they meet back at the same place. The same two meet back at the same place the next year to mate again for a few weeks to a couple of months. So they call it seasonal monogamy, and there's this sleepy lizard, it's called, in Australia that does this.
Interesting.
And one pair has been tallied at 27 straight years now.
Really?
That the same pair have met to mate.
I well, first off, what is the lifespan range of various lizards? I mean, it's probably a huge range, but in my mind, I was thinking lizards got like a few years in them or something. They must have a lot more than that.
We don't have good data for anything that wasn't in a zoo for a long time. So that's the hard part. There's generally a body size thing. Yeah, the little anoles all around the houses in South Florida probably only live 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
As you get bigger, you tend to live longer. And some lizards live up to 30 years, iguanas and things. So, and maybe longer. So that's a tough one. And it's even harder in turtles, which live longer than lizards. We know some turtles are going over 100 easy. So some things are outliving us, which is pretty daunting if you're trying to do research on an animal that outlives you, right?
Yeah. I had a pet turtle. My goodness, how long ago was that? Probably 16 years ago or something. I got it in a relationship, and then when we split up, she took the turtle. Thank goodness. Which and it's still alive. We keep in touch once a year or whatever. Me and the turtle, not her. But yeah, it's still, and we had no idea how old it was when we got it. They didn't know at the pet store or whatever. But it's funny because, I go out and about and I can't really see what the turtle's doing underwater or see much of their behavior. But in a tank, you can see like, okay, well, this turtle does a bunch of nothing all day. But it's a very specific situation. A zoo is a very specific situation. Labs are very specific situation. Most of people's domestic lizards are in a similar, just in an aquarium or whatever, which I imagine is just so drastically different than what life would be like otherwise, and it must make it some of the research a little confusing.
Yeah, but there's been some of the great sort of insights into social behavior have come from researchers keeping animals in the lab, especially in particular, my co-author, Gordon Berghart, did a lot of that kind of work.
Gordon on recently.
Yeah, he's done a lot of that kind of work. And his lab and another lab in the UK have shown recently that turtles engage in something we call conspecific learning. So they learn by watching another individual of their species. And so you can modify your aquarium at home in such a way that you get them to perform something, to choose a color or something, and they get a food reward or whatever. And then you can get them to do things. And so basically what the group in the UK has done, for example, is have a turtle, train a turtle to perform a task and get a reward. And then another turtle can see that turtle perform the task. And that's its only way. You didn't train it, but it figures it out by watching the other turtles.
Wow.
So we've demonstrated that now in turtles and I think in a lizard recently as well. So no one's ever tried, right? These are, we know crows and birds do this regularly. We know mammals can do it. So
I'm trying to think of there's some fish that they were, is it salmon? Maybe. Well, anyway, whatever hatchery or whatever was trying to understand, the role of kind of juvenile development in the species as they release it out in the wild. They're like, when we release these things, are they all just being eaten because they haven't had the natural training that would be provided? And they did similar studies where they would have the predator fish in with some of them. They would have no predator fish in, and then they would have ones where it was both, where the ones with no predator fish would get to watch the ones with the predator fish, and they did pretty well just through observing those interact. Not as good as having the actual experience, but a lot. 100% of them got to live. So trade-offs,
you can't figure that stuff out without experiments, right? You just can't.
Right.
And a really neat one that hasn't been looked at in reptiles, to my knowledge, is mate choice copying. Which humans do. There's a whole research that humans, if a female knows a male gets a lot of matings, she's more attracted to the male. And they've done stuff with fish and experiments with fish and shown that they engage in mate choice copying. And I'm sure we're going to find that this occurs in reptiles as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, especially it seems like, to me, it seems like females in a lot of species, I mean, the environment's always kind of shifting slowly over time. And a lot of times it feels like males are sometimes the kind of spaghetti being thrown against the wall in a given area. And then females maybe having to evaluate a bit more criteria before making a choice, then can look at what other females are choosing, and that being a bit of a like a job reference or something that you would give to get interviewed for a job. Yeah, that's fascinating.
And then sometimes it pays off, and then the way you explain that some individuals don't copy choices of others is that sometimes it doesn't pay off, right? If you copy a bad choice, then you don't pass on your genes, and that happens. And that's why I mentioned earlier, when you get communal nesting in lizards, there'll always be some mothers that go do it on their own. Yeah. Because in some cases, communal nesting has some benefits, but sometimes it all falls apart. There's a famous gathering of sea turtles nesting in Costa Rica called an arrabata, you might have heard of, and we're formerly hundreds of thousands and now tens of thousands get together and nest there. And some of those beaches, the nest success is 2% because it's gotten out of hand. So you got all these turtles nesting in such tight quarters that moms are digging up the eggs of previous moms. So you got all this spoilage everywhere. And then microbes are taking over the whole beach, and because of the spoilage, and killing live eggs. And then you end up with 2% hatch rate because it's just too many turtles trying to nest in one area. So presumably those ones down the beach further that are kind of on their own, they start to pass on their genes more, and this communal thing might fall apart for a while, right? And these things, as you say, in time come and go, theoretically.
Interesting. How does something get take off within I've heard ideas that kind of in game theory modeling, cooperation works really well if pitted against other strategies, but getting it to take off in the first place is really, really difficult. And in some species, the idea being that there was some speciation that happened where a small percentage of the population got isolated in a small island, and there was a lot of relatedness, which led to a lot more reciprocity, and because they were sharing a little more genes, that cooperation was more and more in their favor. And then once they had those cooperative kind of instincts and patterns and habits and genes, everything else evolved and got reintroduced back into the general population through whatever circumstances, that those that cooperative strategy had an advantage within the full population. So I imagine not every case is like that, but still just fascinating to think about the many ways something like that could take off.
Yeah, we can't tell when it doesn't, right? So it's hard to know how often it does and what it takes and what the odds are.
What about, well, first of all, I mean, I would be doing my audience a disservice if we didn't talk about lizard genitals a little bit because we got like hemis, right? We got like two four-headed penises in lizards.
Two penises called hemipenes, and they're each species. They tend to be up close, and the snakes have this as well. Have lots of little spines and things on them. And they fit perfectly into the female, and she can have gaps where the spines go and all that sort of thing. And quite a long time ago, we used that to help tell species apart, where we now tend to use genetics a little bit more. But so it's when you look at a close up of these two hemipenes with all these spines in them, it's painful to think about. It's,
yeah.
But it works really well. So when we catch some of the giant, the bigger monitor lizards in Australia, the males tend to evert those hemipenes, and so we'll have these long purple hemipenes dangling out of the lizard as we hold them. And it's great because the males are the big ones are males. We know that, but when you get an intermediate size, we don't know if it's a male or female, and sometimes that's what we get. So then we know we've got our male.
Wow. Is there what's the advantage of spikes? Is it just you can kind of I've seen some lizards kind of clamp on to a lady for some time and ride her along, or is there something about the like puncturing, like slightly puncturing insides that releases blood flow or something like that nurtures eggs? Or what's the use in a spiky penis? Why
I
don't
think
we all have one?
the main thing is to for fit and to hold on.
Yeah.
Right. So if you see two lizards mating, the male is usually on top or on the side of her, and then his tail is twisted. The base of the tail is twisted over hers, and the hemipene's inside. So, and they often do lots of head bobs and moving around and things. And I think it just helps anchor the hemipenes.
It's just an anchor.
Well,
oh
gosh. It's hard to be. We can be anthropomorphic. Maybe it's
right.
I don't know if it's a stimulation, if there's a stimulation issue there as well.
Right.
It's actually not my area, but it may be there's more to it than just anchoring.
So in terms of evolutionary history, do we know, I imagine the more solitary reptiles came first, or are there more of them, or is there what's the split between solitary and more social lizards?
It's tough because we have a hard time, Shane, figuring out how to call something social. We're trying to move away from calling something social or solitary, because in some aspects of its lifestyle or life history, it could be solitary, in other aspects quite social. So some lizards guard their eggs. Others don't guard their eggs, but do communal nesting. And so there's a lot of social things going on there. Others do that monogamy I talked about. So you could be highly social in a parental care way, and then you could be not very social in terms of your offspring. We find in our book, we talk about how recently in the last maybe 15, 20 years, we're discovering that a lot of rattlesnakes are caring for their babies for weeks to months. So, and even fathers are protecting their young. So these are babies that have been around for weeks, and the father's still protecting them. So my point is, it's really tough. We haven't come up with a system yet to give something a score for how social it is. So we don't like calling everything social and asocial, but I get where you're coming from. So you could just reword it and say, well, more social and less social. And there's not a magic split, but there are just certain groups that engage in certain social behaviors and other groups that don't seem to. And then within those groups, you got exceptions. So most skinks, for example, which is a very speciose group of lizards, most of them lay their eggs and leave, but then there are certain ones that stay with the eggs, guard the eggs, keep them free of fungus, keep them free of predators like beetles. So these things just pop up. They evolve in these groups. And so, but remember, undermining all of this is this knowledge canyon I talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we just don't know. So I can pick a random species, especially somewhere outside of the US or the UK, or Europe, where there's less people. So we go down to the Southern Hemisphere and talk about South America, Africa, and Australia. We just know so little about most lizards and turtles that I can't even begin to tell you whether they're social or more solitary. So we've got a lot of mess to clean up, so to speak, before we can get a full understanding of, I think, your question of how the social stuff falls out across the different types of lizards.
Could you give just kind of a kind of evolutionary history of lizards? How long have they been around, and kind of where they fit into our evolutionary past?
Their closest relatives are the snakes. So snakes have basically evolved from an ancestor with lizards. If you go back further, you bring in you bring in other reptiles, then you bring in the dinosaurs, and your other vertebrates go fit in there. We have a tough time knowing exactly. It's very difficult to retrieve some of those deep roots in evolutionary relationships, exactly where mammal-like reptiles came off of stem reptiles and all those sorts of things. So it's hard to retrieve that with any real accuracy, but we know enough that things like dinosaurs, which tend to be reptilian when we look at them, right? Were around for so long that they had a chance to evolve all sorts of social behaviors in their history, right? So hundreds of millions of years, it's a long time. So when you ask about how things like social behavior fall across different groups, we have to think about that. And we've got a little bit of fossil evidence for communal nesting in dinosaurs and things like that. Apparently there were these above ground nests of big dinosaur eggs, and mothers were all guarding them in a group. And so there's really interesting stuff going on there that has vanished and we don't see in modern reptiles, unfortunately. So, little interesting fragmentary fossils that give us insights into what was going on a long time ago.
Yeah. And is it, sometimes you hear that, that like the crocs and stuff were around during dinosaurs. Is that true?
Yeah, we had crocodilians, we had turtles in particular. Turtles have been around a long, long time. And there's speculation about how the shell evolved. It's really fascinating. There's an early turtle-like, marine-like turtle that only had a bottom shell, not a top shell. And there's argument about whether that was the missing link sort of thing.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that was, I think, 280 million years ago or something. So,
and then that little chest armor just kept on getting selected for until it wrapped around. Fascinating.
Yeah. And it can happen probably. And
why doesn't anything else have any? Well, I mean, I guess armadillos.
Sure.
Couple other little things, but
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely evolved in armadillos and similar things in things like pangolins and anteaters and things like that. A bit of that kind of protection.
Yeah.
So, but it comes with trade-offs, right? So, most of those things that have that kind of armor are then slow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they've traded off speed for armor, and both work, right, for predators, and they both work maybe differently for different predators. So, down here in Florida, we've got the Florida soft-shelled turtle, which has traded off its armor, right? It's a pancake. It's lost the bones and the edge of its shell. It's just cartilage. And so it's like this pancake that can shoot through the water. So it would be difficult for a gator to catch it. But once they catch it, it's history, right? And I get friends send me videos of gators torturing these poor soft-shelled turtles.
Yeah.
Whereas there's YouTube videos with a gator trying to eat a hard-shelled turtle, and he just can't do it. He's just flipping it up the side down and can't crush it, right? And so so there's those trade-offs there that work. They both work. Speed works, armor works. Sometimes it's best to have one or the other.
Is it just that well, I mean, I guess gators are certainly trying to crush the thing and can't. It must just be because you'd think you could still kill a turtle, but if you can't eat the thing, it's
they do. It's
not worth all the
just
energy.
a size thing with the gators and the turtles, and it's a study I've been wanting to do for a while, where we ask which size gator can eat what size turtle. Because you get a big enough gator and boy, you'll just be walking through the swamp and hear crunch, So a big enough gator can crunch a good sized turtle. But the really big female cooter turtles and slider turtles, it takes a really big gator to be able to break their shell. And whether or not they spend some time trying to nibble on the head and legs and things, I'm not sure. But it's an interesting question. It's difficult to test without, we can't do experiments with, we can't.
You just throw
we
one
can't
in
get ethics approval for throwing, right?
Crush it or not.
So, and then if you use a turtle shell from a dead turtle, it's not as strong as a live turtle's shell. And so there's a lot of work to be done, some physics and things to figure out to mimic a proper turtle shell and look at the bite force of a crocodilian and try to put it all together. But it'll be a fun study.
And what about reptiles, history and the origins of flight?
Yeah. So, we're pretty much sure that, birds evolved out of a dinosaur and therefore essentially a reptilian type ancestor. There's a lot of debate about exactly how it started and whether these dinosaurs were running around and gliding a little bit or gliding off a tree and all this. And there's some fantastic fossils that show how flight evolved in some of these early sort of things. And then we have the pterodactyls, which evolved flight separately from the other birds. And then we have flight evolving in the insects, right? And then in the bats. So that's 4. It's either 4 or 5 independent evolutions of proper flight.
Yeah.
And those are them. And then of course we've got gliding things, right? Which are almost flight.
Yeah.
And we see those in lizards and snakes in Borneo and Southeast Asia, right? We've got the Draco, the little lizards that are the little flying dragons that are going from tree to tree, and flying snakes, which are fantastic to watch. I'm sure you've probably seen a YouTube of that. So
it seems like such a handy thing to evolve. You can see why it happened in so many different circumstances. From because I think in some cases it was, feathers were more something for warmth, and then kind of got big enough eventually, or you could show off by jumping and get just a little bit more air or something, possibly to attract a mate. And then next thing you know, oh, look, we can fly. You just got to give it thousands and thousands of generations.
And the physics is amazing of the whole. We're still trying to, it's not reptiles, so I'm not involved in it, but ornithologists and people trying to understand feathers and how they work. It's just super complex, and it's something that we haven't been able to copy yet for human flight, right? For jets and what have you.
So what about the diversity of lizards? Are there, what are some things like I guess one, if you just, what is the criteria for what is a lizard? And then what sort of things do you tend to see as just really common traits? And then what areas do you tend to see a bit more diversity between species? Is that a difficult question to answer?
It's okay. We have some groups of lizards that are super conserved in their body shape and roughly how their appendages look and tail, etc. Like the monitor lizards, they're something like between 50 and 70 species, and we got some miniature ones that are like this, and they're pretty much the same thing as the Komodo dragons in terms of their body shape. And so we have a highly conserved lizard body plan, and that's kind of the basic shape of a lizard, right? It's the legs are more sprawled out than mammals, right? Mammals, the legs are more under the animal, and the lizards tend to move that front right leg at the same time they move the back left, and that's how they go back and forth as they move. And some of them can reach tremendous speeds and take advantage of anaerobic respiration and what have you. The skinks and the geckos are both big groups that, once you get this group, which we put them in a family kind of arbitrarily, most of the skinks are diurnal, most of the geckos are nocturnal, and there's a few exceptions, but and the diversity you asked about is really interesting in the geckos with their toe pads and their ability to stick. There's just such
a cool superpower.
It's amazing, and it's achieved differently in different ways in different groups of geckos. So it comes down when morphologists study this and physicists, it comes down to these little tiny forces involved in the little tiny webbing. So it's not just some sticky glue substance or something. It's all about negative pressure and suction and all sorts of really interesting things. And the toe pad structures can be very different in different groups of geckos.
Yeah, that's incredible. I've seen some of those drawings trying to explain it, and yeah, you're absolutely right that intuitively you think, oh, their fingers, their pads stick, and it seems like glue or something. Wait, what about, could you give a little bit some of the history of lizard research? Because I really like when sometimes you get to see some of the early thinking on things, even hundreds of years ago or whatever, when people first started, cataloging things that they would discover and whatnot, because there's so many, and this may not be your area, but sometimes it gives insight into kind of intuitively what we as humans assume is happening. And then often that evolves over time, and much like we think that lizards are solitary just because of intuitively, and we find out that they're actually much more social. So what's kind of some of the history of lizard research?
I think signaling has been a big one. So the signaling between say, rival males and between males and females, males to females, with the dewlaps, all the species with the colored dewlaps, all the anoles. There was a lot of early work looking at that signaling. And so that was kind of the, in this theme of social behavior, Gordon Berghart, who you've already talked to, and a bunch of colleagues in 1976 got together at a conference and held a special symposium on the social behavior of reptiles. And they were the first to kind of say, hey, there's some social things going on here, and let's put it on the map. And so high on their list was this signaling that had been seen in these lizards that kind of do make themselves obvious. The males, in order to show off for the females and attract her with head bobs and push-ups and blue patches under their bellies and dewlaps and all these different things, you can study that, right? So the males have to kind of take a chance to attract females. So they're out in the open on a big boulder, for example, trying to tell other males, this is my territory, while they're attracting a female at the same time. And so a lot of the early work on social behavior in lizards was this really obvious signaling. And you could go out and watch these males and get a lot of data without scaring them, because they've got to hang in there to get the mating and be bold, right? And so you see that around your house in South Florida, right? You see the males being very bold. And that works until it doesn't work, right?
Yeah. It's a gamble.
Yeah. So some of the other things they talked about, there was communal nesting, and Gordon had worked on that in iguanas in Central America. And there were a lot of the male-male combat stuff was covered too, in lizards and snakes in particular. So some species and some don't engage in this male combat before, presumably over a female. You often don't see the female. She's either being secretive or they know she's around. And two males will fight, and it's often what they call ritualistic. It's not really deadly or to the death, or
right.
Sometimes some blood is drawn, but it's not designed to kill the other. I'm guessing because if it's too risky, right? Because you might be the one to die, so you don't need to die. So it's a wrestling match, right? Between, and I often get friends or whatever that see two snakes pushing on each other and send me a picture and say, I found two snakes mating, but it's usually two males wrestling.
Yeah, I like the what's the one that does the push-ups?
There are a bunch, but
there's a bunch.
There's a bunch.
That's what a funny way to show, especially from a human point of view.
Some of the anoles, some of the anoles do it. The fence lizards do it. The spiny lizards out west do it. It's a pretty popular one for lizards. In fact, all over the world, it's usually a head bob or a push up or both. Some variation of head bobbing and push ups, and it's quite complex because sometimes what appears to be the same behavior can have a different meaning, and so it depends on someone sending you a signal and what you send back. So the context of the signal being sent to you is needed to interpret your reaction. So in other words, you can use a head bob to dominate, and you can use a head bob to submit. So it's really interesting, and it receives a lot of attention from researchers because lizards, some species of lizards are quite obvious and will let you watch them do these things.
Yeah, because I was going to say, are those push-ups always just males trying to attract females, or is there some signaling to potential predators ever that like, hey, I'm the fittest lizard around, better check out some other. I think there's some lizard around missing a leg. Go and get.
That's the challenge, right? So we see these behaviors. It hasn't been established for that species, and we've got to test it and figure out with experiments and context and behavioral observations. Is it to attract females? Is it to send a signal to rival males? Or is it what you were talking about, which is called a predator deterrent or pursuit deterrent signal that says, I see you, predator, so don't bother chasing me because you're not going to get me. And the predator needs to recognize that signal, right? Because then the predator will not chase because it's a waste of the predator's time. And so that's like a kangaroo thumping, when a kangaroo thumps its foot, it's saying to the dingo or the other predators, I can see you.
I
can see you. Don't bother chasing me.
Yeah, beavers do that.
Yep.
Gazelles have the big... that's the kind of classic one, right?
Yep.
Jumping super high up into the air they stand out, so it's confusing why they do that. But if it's signaling to the predator, like, look how high I can jump, I can definitely outrun you.
Yeah, they've already been discovered, right? So they're saying, two things potentially with the gazelles. One is, I see you, and this is a signal that says I see you. And then two, I'm very fit.
Yeah. And you've lost the element of surprise.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So some lizards do this. We have revealed that in some lizards, but so few have been looked at that it's going to take another many decades of more people going out doing these sorts of things to work out to get a fuller understanding.
If people are like, hey, I'm sitting here in Buffalo where I don't want to be, and I'd much rather be out in Australia or Florida or
South
something,
Florida.
looking like lizards. There's no end in sight for lizard research.
There's no end in sight.
To have to worry about running out of work.
No end in sight, but the pay is not sort of Dr. Lawyer scale.
Yeah, right.
Passion required.
Right. So I made a joke about a lizard losing a limb, but they regenerate limbs, don't they?
They regenerate toes. They can regenerate toes and tails, right? Tails.
Tails. That's what, and that's usually like if a predator snags it, you can just kind of break your own tail, just release the emergency escape.
It works really well. You see it with the cat, right? Your house cat. It'll be sitting there with the tail and the lizard's gone. So there's a great one in Australia too that I published a little note on, and I had heard it from a friend first, that there was this legless lizard in Australia about this long, quite secretive, but if you go out on the roads at night, you can find them, right? And it's mostly tail. It's like our glass lizards here in Florida. So it's a legless lizard. It's lost its legs. It's so it kind of looks like a snake, but it has eyelids and things like a lizard. And I was told by a friend, a colleague, that the tail came off of one, and that it did the tail actually moved like a snake off the road. And I was on a road in West Australia, and a car just rolled over one. We stopped to look at it, and it was unfortunately dying, flipping around, and the tail was broken but not quite removed. And I pulled it off, and the tail went right off the road, like 20 feet away.
Wow.
We since got videos of this, and it's just amazing. So some tails don't just squiggle there in place, they actually go somewhere.
Wow, that's so cool. So it's you let your tail go, and then the predator's off chasing.
So you're evolving something that you've evolved something that actually is not part of your living self anymore, which is pretty fascinating.
Huh.
Richard Dawkins called it extended phenotype, right? Like a beaver dam.
Yeah. Yeah. Huh. Man, that's in. But what's with the regenerating toes? Is it just like changing your shoes once in a while? That's not getting away from predators, right?
No, but if any of us could regenerate our digits, we would be more useful than having lost one, right? So
Right.
you see it in crickets and all sorts of marine animals, starfish, sea stars. There's all sorts of salamanders regenerate toes. There's a lot of regeneration skills evolved in different animals, and it attracts a lot of attention from researchers because we want to be able to regenerate a lost finger, for example. So it does get a lot of attention, and they're learning more and more about it. So I think with fingers and stuff and a lizard, you want to be able to run fast, etc., right? And if you've lost a digit, it would be good to grow it back.
Yeah, that would be incredible. What other biomimicry stuff are they working on with lizards? Because at the end of the day, like, what's in it for us, right? That's what
Sometimes that's what we're faced with as scientists. We can do our esoteric research, but if we can't show a benefit for humans,
I had this researcher on it just it stuck with me just because it's this person that oh shoot, I'm forgetting her name, sorry person, but she was in Washington, the University of Vancouver, and studying regeneration in hearing in hair cells in fish hair cell. They regenerate their hearing, and so looking at it like, can we do that? And which is this amazing, imagine being able to regenerate your hearing, not having to worry about hearing loss and
or wearing a hearing aid,
or wearing hearing aids, or listening to music too loud, or whatever else. And I think she was getting like $8,000 a year or something like that in funding to regenerate human hearing.
Wow.
Just like, what is wrong with people's priorities? It's just because if you don't know about this stuff, it sounds weird. We're studying fish hearing cells, and then some politician or whatever is going to go, well, why the hell would we waste our time doing that? So
sometimes our arguments are good and we just are not getting our points across for whatever reason,
right?
So about 3/4 of my work is conservation related, and if you don't care about the biodiversity crisis and the fact that we're losing species, there are still things like invasive species causing, billions of dollars of damage across the world. So there are economic costs of things like invasive species, and in some cases biodiversity losses. So it's hard to get some of those points across, and sometimes we can't deliver guaranteed results, right? So scientists are working on probabilities, and
do people hate that. That's like the number of arguments that I've had with people that they're like, won't get vaccinated because you can still get COVID or transmit can. It is possible. It is possible when wearing a seatbelt to die in a car accident. Right. It doesn't render seatbelts worthless.
Apparently, we just don't teach it well in grade school, right? In elementary school, we could, right? People should be able to grasp that. It doesn't seem.
It's crazy. So I mean, my hope is still after 18 months of feeling pretty defeated. My hope is still that this is going to be an opportunity for enlightenment in some ways, in terms of understanding the importance of a few of these. You talk about biodiversity loss and invasive species and conservation. I think this idea of zoonosis, from biodiversity loss, from ecosystem loss, from land loss, forcing species closer together, to global travel and global shipping, creating more of these, not just with COVID, but with murder hornets get pinged on the news every May or so, and certainly all over our country now, invasive species killing a bunch of trees when people, potentially from taking firewood from one area into another area. And that might start showing up on people's radar a little bit more.
I hope so.
I don't know.
It's disappointing that we talk about variants and no one understands that that the Delta variant has evolved. It's a very simple thing, and even doctors tend to not use the lingo, right? It's a mutant and it's evolution. Instead, they use softer words like variants and
adapted. I usually say adapted if I'm in a certain club where I know the word evolution's going to really upset people, and I'll say adaption or something like that, or just change over time. It's just people, the idea that evolution is such a trigger word for so many people is discouraging.
Yeah, and you don't see much talk about the ultimate cause of COVID-19 from the coronavirus. It's all about how can we, and I get it, like we need to fix the immediate problem. We need human health needs to be taken care of, but the public needs to know how this happened, and evolution is a part of it, right? And we think it's a pangolin from a bat, or, we're not 100% sure what the intermediate host was and what have you. But if you do the genetic work, which they're going crazy doing it, it's come from bats through some intermediate host, and it's evolving as it goes. And so, this is the fifth coronavirus since the 1960s. Mm-hmm. We've had 5 of these things. 2 of them were minor, didn't cause anything. 3 of them, the other 3 were SARS, MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, and then this one, COVID-19. So all 3 of those were bad, and this one is terrible, right? So if we've had 5 of these things since the 1960s, we got more coming, right?
Yeah.
So we need to understand, that wildlife trafficking might have been behind it all, for example. Yeah. Because you have these meat wet markets with all these animals in cages, and they're dripping on each other, and all these new things come out of this. We know this. So regardless of which one it was and which market and all that, it doesn't matter. We're going to have more of these things if we don't change how we perceive things like wildlife trafficking. So people don't care. I just published a paper with colleagues in the criminology department about the relative costs of human trafficking, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and wildlife trafficking, right? So as you would guess, wildlife trafficking comes out 4th on that list for people in terms of care, the human perception that it's a problem, et cetera, et cetera. The cost was also 4th, right? Mm-hmm. Well, if we can blame COVID-19 on wildlife trafficking, which we might be able to, it looks like, then it's become the most costly of all the trafficking by far, right? The cost of COVID-19 it's almost immeasurable. It's in the tens of trillions or something, right? So So now wildlife trafficking should be on the map as a really serious problem that we need to put resources in, and politicians, governments need to get on it, because it can on its own essentially cause a COVID-19.
Yeah, it's pretty tricky though. Even though the small cost of the preventative stuff is, I mean, people are never, we aren't going to have a holiday once a year where we celebrate and show gratitude for all the pandemics that we didn't have this year because we, took some of the, more rigorous biosecurity practices from industrial farming and applied them to things like wet markets and other things around the world, and
can't measure it.
That's like I don't know how I've been safe, or I've been careful, pretty darn careful. I haven't gotten COVID. It's impossible for me to measure the COVID that I didn't have. I'm grateful that I haven't gotten COVID, but it's hard to, once you're, choking on your own lung fluids, you have a real appreciation for the seriousness of it after the fact. But it's such a
human nature, I guess. We just don't, it's not my area, obviously, but it's just, we can't appreciate the cost of what would have happened.
Well, it's also funny to me. I've been thinking more lately about how we've kind of evolved to make it very difficult to understand evolution. The way in which we've evolved, we have a lot of just top-down thinking, the ability to have a social animal that has these kind of agreed upon big ideas of liberty or freedom or gods or whatever, like this kind of top down sort of making sense of life that has a lot of utility in terms of motivating one to get out of bed in the morning or whatever. It can kind of backfire in terms of explanatory power and create all sorts of cognitive dissonance and denial and things when these unexpected emergent properties of evolved complex dynamic systems start springing up and you hadn't taken a biology course in your life. So it's tricky situation. So in terms of actually, can we close with the conservation side of things? Because I just had one or two really quick other. One, biomimicry. They do stuff with understanding suction cups and things from the geckos, right? Are there any other cool ones you can think of off the top of your head? Otherwise, I have next question.
The regeneration a bit, I think, although I hear more about that in salamanders for their digits than I do.
It'd be fun to have one salamander digit. Like, I know the idea is that we regenerate our own digit, but to be able to regenerate a different species digit.
Well, there's a salamander here in Florida called a one-toed 𝕊𝕐𝕗. And it's an eel. It's an eel-like salamander, and it has 4 legs, tiny legs they're losing them, right? Evolutionarily.
Yeah.
And they're losing the toes as well. There's a 3-toed, a 2-toed, and a 1-toed.
Evolution's just digesting them over time.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny when you just see this one little leg with a little toe on the end of it.
Huh.
And they move through the water like an eel, so they undulate, and they've got a slightly dorsal laterally flattened tail, and so they don't really use those legs anymore, and they kind of move, but they don't do anything. So they're losing them. So there is a one-toed salamander.
what about the? I wanted to ask in terms of the social life. What about hunting? Is there social hunting at all? I mentioned pack hunters early on.
Yeah, we think there's some social hunting with the crocodilians, especially American alligators, getting together in groups and herding fish.
Oh man, in case you weren't scared of alligators enough already, I was worried about one alligator getting me. Now they're pack hunters.
Well, it's for fish so far, I think, mainly.
Okay.
But there's been a few observations. You got to go out in the swamps at night. My other co-author, the Russian Vladimir, he's Donetsk. He has done a lot of crocodilian work across the world at night in swamps, etc. And it's a tough place to be. It's tough to see what you're doing. There's mosquitoes, it's hot, etc. And then, you got to make sure you're not a meal for some of the bigger ones. But there's just not enough people out watching. But they definitely, he thinks he also saw groups of gators moving toward a pig on the edge of the water's edge. So the other possibility is those Komodo dragons we spoke about, because they'll get together on a kill or a dying buffalo or deer, whatever, and use one another as leverage and pull bits apart. So we know they cooperate with feeding, and then they will follow. They sometimes will hamstring one of these deer and then follow it. There seems to be some possibilities that they're doing some group cooperation in that hunting, and then especially in feeding.
Fascinating. All right. Well, let's close with a little conservation talk. That's a super important issue. I've been getting more and more into the idea of One Health, and the concept of human and animal and ecosystem interconnectedness, and kind of bringing more light to that subject. So, what's your work with in terms of conservation efforts with lizards?
Mostly, we mentioned earlier that there are a lot of invasive lizards in Florida. It's probably, the worst place for invasive reptiles in the world, possibly. And Florida Fish and Game are overwhelmed. They don't have the money to control these animals, so that you can't eradicate any of them. You could potentially control some of them in certain areas, but so they have to prioritize, which ones are causing problems. And we don't have enough of those data. We don't know the impacts of all these different invasive lizards on native communities, animal communities. So
what's going on here? Because so you're saying in Florida, where you can step outside, look around, and see lizards crawling around your house, people are importing other lizards to have as pets or something, and then they're getting released?
You got geckos and anoles on your house, the little guys, but people are bringing in these beautiful rainbow agamas from Africa, and butterfly agamas from Southeast Asia, and basilisk lizards from Central and South America. These are all neat pets, right? And you bring them in, and then they get away. And now we got populations of these things all over the place. So, tend to be bigger things. And we got the tegus, which are even bigger, and the Nile monitors are here. So some 30-some species here that don't belong. And
wow.
So we need impact studies so that we can say, all right, this one's not too much of a problem, or this one is a big problem. And this feeds back into, if we can't afford to control them, maybe we can control them in one area where they're affecting an endangered species. But if we can't afford to control them, we need to understand how they do so well and make sure we don't let others in that are related. And it's a challenging sort of game, but some of my research is to try to go out and look at impacts, and also predict how these things are going to spread and disperse. And then that brings in climate warming, right? So as the climate warms, the niche for these animals can shrink or get bigger.
Yeah.
And these things can all march further north and that sort of thing. So that's something we're getting heavily involved in too.
Yeah, that's the thing with warming is there's winners and losers, probably more losers, but it's still in terms of just drastic population changes, and spread and migration are probably going to be deeply impactful in ways that we can't possibly predict, but not necessarily for the one species of lizard that does really well for it,
Right.
or whatever.
Right. And I'm also, my lab's doing a lot of work on climate change, predicting climate change impacts on native species. So, especially turtles. So we've got a lot of turtles down here, that are nesting in South Florida. So we can ask the question, is climate change going to affect the adults or the eggs most? And well, an adult can move into the shade, but the eggs can't, right? So the mom puts the eggs in the ground and she leaves. So the eggs are just going to be laid in hotter and hotter places as the climate changes, unless she makes a decision, quote unquote, a genetically underpinned decision to put her eggs in a more shaded area. And so I do a lot of work on nesting in turtles to try to understand what her choices are and what they would be in a climate change scenario. And so, for example, if you're a soft-shell turtle, they nest quite out in the open. So we would predict they could just start nesting in the shade. So as long as they can win the race, as long as climate change isn't so fast compared to the generation time of a soft-shell turtle, then the moms should be able, the ones that lay in more shaded areas should pass on their genes and soft-shell turtles will be fine. But the mud turtles are laying in full shade right now. So how are they going to nest cooler in a climate change scenario? So these are the kind of studies that I'm doing at the moment. And some of them involve just being in Florida, and some I look at geographic variation. I go up the coast to, say, New York and look at what already has evolved, right? So are snapping turtles in Canada laying in more open places because the summers are cooler up there than they are in Florida? And from that, we can predict, well, that was in the evolutionary repertoire of snapping turtles. So we think that they'll be okay, or they can shift to the shade as the climate warms and those sorts of things.
It is sort of impressive in a way from the point of view of a really successful invasive species. Just imagine the chance. What an odd chance happening where you're some lizard in Africa that's just evolved just enough in this ecosystem where you've carved out enough of a slice of life and to just make it by, and to just get mates, and to just get enough food and just escape enough predators, and you're kind of at on a knife's edge, and then some weird primate species picks you up and brings you somewhere else. And then, I mean, so many invasive species probably weren't invasive. So many species came to a less favorable environment where when they escaped or whatever didn't, or they couldn't find a mate or whatever else. But in that rare chance happening where you've just landed in paradise, where you're you find this new thing to eat that has absolutely no defenses evolved for you, and has never seen anything like you, and just these populations can just explode out of nowhere.
You might be free of parasites because you've been bred in captivity, so they might have almost no parasites, and then so it's going to take a while for them to pick up the parasites from Florida, that sort of thing.
Right.
So it's fascinating. And there are stories that are, some of them are true. How much this happens, we don't know. That reptile pet trade breeders would deliberately release groups of lizards so that they could, and then that little population would explode, and then they could go get those lizards as they needed them to sell them, rather than have 50 aquariums in their room and have to feed all these things, right?
Yeah. Not to mention, you're sticking a bunch of lizards in your pants and walking through airport security and riding with these things.
Oh man, there's some serious. They take it very seriously in Australia. If you get caught taking an animal out or in, you're in deep trouble. So
don't put a koala bear in your carry-on.
That's
or if
right.
you do, like, really research how to smuggle things ahead of time. Well, awesome. Well, this is a fun conversation. Did you have any, I want to make sure and plug your book and everything, but did you have any, were there any open loops there that you wanted to close or anything?
No, that was fun. I enjoyed that as well. And
well, check out the Secret Social Lives of Reptiles, everybody, with both Gordon, who was on recently. Oh my gosh, Gordon recommended you. Not I said Jeff Larson earlier, but that's in the same poker group. Yeah, it was Gordon. It was Gordon that recommended you, and Vladimir Dinetz. So yeah, check that out. And also, anything else that you wanted to plug at all, Sean? Your university site or anything like that?
Well, check out our conservation biology program at USF, our graduate program. And that's about it. Thanks, Shane.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. We'll talk with you more next week. All right. Once again, as a reminder, check out my episode on Pete Holmes. You Made It Weird. It's a real fun episode, my 5th appearance. Me and Pete, we get along great. We have terrific conversations. So you're going to like that. I always get to see a different side of me when I'm a guest rather than a host and that sort of thing. Your Patreon support helps so much and is 100% used to fund the making of this show. You know who doesn't see $1 profit? This guy. So keep this show alive. Go to patreon.com/Shane Mauss. And more details soon of hopefully exciting projects clicking into place. Next week on the show, talking about bushmeat trade, and talking about another One Health episode, talking about the intersection between humans, animals, and the environment. Talking a little bit about zoonosis, pathogens that influence all of those connections, biodiversity loss, different cultures, how to influence. We really talk a lot about into how to influence and change norms as new information comes in. As scientists, etc., become aware of, that's a good sneeze. Should stop and re-record. Not going to. That's just, well, you just saw was a perfect. It's a perfect sneeze. If every sneeze was like that, life would be so much better. So reset. All right. Doesn't matter what I was just talking about, but I do remember. So we were talking about resetting norms, how to influence not not just others, not just like another individual, but talking about how to create cultural change kind of more from the bottom up by talking with citizens, with people in communities. And really, really cool episode, important subject matter. So check that out. And those of you that listen all the way to the end, you are, of course, my favorites.